The Legend of Zelda series has undergone a lot of changes recently, with the most recent game in the series, Echoes of Wisdom, releasing recently, and very much showcasing that we have entered a new era of Zelda. Or I should say, we've been in this hole for upwards of 2 games already with this new open-style Zelda formula. In this video, I just wanted to kind of just go over the years and see exactly how everything changed from the very beginning to where we are today, because even though it's not that drastic, the fact that the series has undergone different formula changes and everything is just something that I wanted to talk about this week. Now, I would say the Zelda series has kind of 3 different eras that has sort of followed into, starting off with the experimentation era, with of course the first game in the series, The Legend of Zelda, following up until around Link's Awakening for the Game Boy. Now, why I'm calling it the experimentation era is because there wasn't really a set era at this time, but it's very obvious that throughout those games there was very much a trial and error effort going on with each entry in the series, with the first one being a more top-down, more roam around, where you kind of figure out the world to yourself and figure out its quirks, with the sequel Zelda 2 kind of shifting into a side-scrolling view and overall focusing on platforming a little more after Mario had did so well. But the one thing that kind of kept these games all together was, of course, the main character, the different dungeons, the enemies in the game, and of course, the bad guy and Zelda. I mean, come on. And it goes into our last entries in this sort of experimentation era with the series, with A Link to the Past, and even an extent Link's Awakening. With A Link to the Past taking those original concepts from the original Legend of Zelda, and overall expanding it and giving it a lot more depth that the game really needed, and it showed because it was one of the highest rated Zelda games at the time. And to this day, it is one of the more classic entries in the series that people, to this day, still actively play. The game is solid. It has a very, very great art style that stands the test of time even today, and overall kind of spawning the whole sort of dungeon puzzle era that we saw. Of course, there was in the original, but I feel like this was the main entry that really showed that, okay, these dungeons are really the key to this, and they're mainly the thing that I think people really want in these games, more or less. And so it kind of just became that fundamental sort of step that each game had to kind of feature a set of dungeons, a story about a hero and a princess, and about an evil pig dude that destroys everything. But even then, there's not much to really go over with this sort of experimentation era. Link's Awakening, the real major deal with that is that it was on a handheld console, and at the time it was unheard of for really. A game at that size was actually on one of those tiny little cartridges, and you could play anywhere you want to. I know, it was a far-off concept back then, I know. But I can't argue with the fact that the original spawned that sort of handheld era for Zelda that showed that those games can do decently well on the system. But even so, taking all of that information and all of the successes and failures and criticisms that they got from those games, it boiled into what I would like to call the next big era for Zelda. This next era I kind of want to just call the Hero of Time era, because basically every single game around that time kind of followed around the concept of time in a sense, mostly because the next game that released was Ocarina of Time! Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time was one of the big breakout hits for the series that really made the series kind of a household name, and especially for Nintendo, it made their second best series ever. And as it should, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time was revolutionary. In 1998, a 3D adventure game that you can just kind of go where you want, in a sense, it was unheard of. Now, I mean, obviously, you can't really go where you want to. The game has set ticks that it needs to cross for you to actually get to certain dungeons, story elements, and of course, fight Ganon. But back then, if you were a kid on your N64 playing through that original game, walking out into Hyrule Field probably felt exhilarating. Like, you could do anything. Now, if you look at it today, it's kind of just a blank world with a ranch and a castle at the end of it. The game followed a certain structure, which we'll kind of go into more detail as we go on to the thing. It was sort of, you were a young child in a forest, set off on an adventure that you never knew that you were a part of. Getting wrapped up into this weird old quest with time and the Master Sword, and then overall having the game basically open up right when you get the Master Sword. It was a big deal that when you actually got to the Master Sword, it was like, okay, here's the real game, buddy. Having the game start out with 3 dungeons to get your feet wet, to really show what they were capable of for those last few dungeons, is why I think Ocarina of Time just did so well, and why it became the formula for the next decade of Zelda. And that is not a joke. With Ocarina of Time selling over 7.6 million copies at the time, and it was its best-selling title, it was obvious that people took a liking to this sort of formula, and Nintendo wanted to make sure of it. Basically putting this game as a pinpoint for what the series should be going forward. Like, this is the only game that you should look at for ideas and pieces for your game that you want to take from. It was basically the foundation of the series. After this next game in this era was Majora's Mask, the 1-year game development hell that ended up becoming my favorite game of all time. I want to make a separate video talking about this game because there's, in my opinion, nothing else like it. And this was actually the first game where Eiji Aonuma was the primary director for the series, which he would later go on to direct Breath of the Wild and a lot of those games that we're going to be playing for the next decade. But even so, the series has never really tapped into these weird dark tones and themes, really ever. Of course, we could go into Ocarina of Time, and of course Ganon, and the whole story behind his whole rule of the world is obviously really dark, but Majora's Mask taking place in a 3-day loop of a whole town and basically world that is going to die in that 3 days, and following every single NPC and character that lives in that world, and overall see them fall to depression and grief. It was something so bold and different for the series that I think to this day has never ever been replicated. But the main thing that kind of ties back to the evolution and what they took from it is mostly just the time elements. Like, there was still a large part of time, like you still had the Ocarina of Time, you had the Song of Time, there was more like double Song of Time. Time was still a very large key factor of the series. And of course, the dungeons that were scattered throughout the game, there weren't as many, but to an extent, those dungeons were so unique that to me, that makes them stand out a lot more than the 7 or 8, if you want to include the castle at the end in Ocarina of Time. Like I said, I do want to do a whole separate video talking about just the Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask and how the development of the game sort of influenced a lot of the ideas that came into the game and why that will never really happen again. It's sort of like a lightning in a bottle kind of deal. After that entry, it kind of took a little break into the waters. We're mostly just focused on the handheld titles that were actually developed by Capcom. I haven't personally played any of the Oracle games, and I have been meaning to go back. I do want to try it out on the Switch Online, but I just need to get around to it. And the games released simultaneously, kind of like how Pokemon released their handheld games, but still, these games are kind of indifferent. They still follow that sort of formula, with Oracle of Ages having time travel being one of the big game mechanics. So time is still a very big part of these games, but with Capcom in development with them, and there's obviously on very underpowered hardware, these games sort of stand out in this era and kind of branch out into their own kind of era, but it just never really went past that, because the next big game that came after those was The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker. And at the time, this game was met with very critical reception. Mostly because during their GameCube announcement, when they showed off this brand new console, they showed off this Zelda demo with Link fighting Ganon, and it looked really solid. Like, it obviously had a mix of the Ocarina of Time art style with some really higher up models, but it got people thinking, like, imagine just a realistic Zelda game. And so after all that hype and people speculating about what the next game would be, The Wind Waker hits him like a goddamn bullet. The Wind Waker is viewed a lot more highly nowadays as we got those entries in the series down the line, with some of its main criticisms actually garnering a lot of respect as time has gone on. The game was very ahead of its time, and Nintendo knew that when they re-released it for the Wii U almost 10 years later. But coming from a time when the original Xbox was releasing, the PlayStation 2 had already been released, people were expecting a little more from Nintendo at the time, and even though the game I still think is great. The only downside is I'm not the biggest fan of the sailing. I think that's just, how do we elongate the game with some exploration in the middle? Oh, let's just put a giant ocean in the middle! But even so, that shouldn't take away from the game's actual design because of this just single one choice. Because it's still obviously a very well-renowned Zelda game, and has some of the better dungeons in the series. Like, I love that Tower of Gods dungeon, where you basically ascend this tower starting out on your boat and then basically just going up to the top of it. It was really cool. But the game still kind of followed that sort of formula that Ocarina of Time had set in place. The game had about 7 dungeons, it had different creatures and race groups for different parts of the game. Now, the Wind Waker doesn't really feature time. It's the main thing that the game really doesn't tackle in a sense. Obviously, there are elements in the game that suggest like different times and eras, but the Wind Waker kind of felt like that first step where they wanted to kind of branch out from the series in a little bit, but still obviously keeping the same bullet points that Ocarina of Time sort of laid out for the series and what I think the directors wanted for the game. I will mention this just real quickly, mostly because these two are kind of, they follow under that Oracle of Ages, Oracle of Seasons sort of branch with The Legend of Zelda Four Swords Adventures and The Legend of Zelda The Minish Cap. With the Minish Cap actually being a full-fledged Zelda game, but it was fully developed by Capcom, where the game basically takes place in a scene of like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, and you just shrink down into this sort of small version of Hyrule where you get to explore those little nooks and crannies. And for a handheld version of the series, it was a really unique take. Now, I have not personally played it in full. I've not played a lot of the handheld Zeldas, but Four Swords Adventures, the game is more of a co-op puzzle game, which is still, I think, one of the base components of the Zelda series with puzzles in a sense, but this one felt like it was just, here's just the basics of basics for Zelda, but you can play up to 4 people. That was it. It kept a lot of the stylistic choices that the Wind Waker had with the sort of chibi version of Link being used, so it seemed like that they were definitely pushing for this new art style for Zelda, but it wouldn't last long. It would not last long. The next big entry in this Ocarina of Time era was The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, or I would like to call it The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time 2. Finally, all of those worries that people were wanting that realistic, modern Zelda were all washed away. Now, I'm not going to deny that there are a lot of different elements in this game that help it stand out, with the main thing being the Twilight Realm and that Link can turn into a wolf. The Twilight Realm is basically a replacement for the time travel in the game, but the game's sort of structure follows kind of the exact same pace as Ocarina of Time. You're a boy in a forest who starts out with nothing, who then goes to fight 3 different dungeons, which each represent a different theme of that area. With once you finish those 3 dungeons, you get the Master Sword, and then you go on to fight the other 4 dungeons, with mixed in with some Twilight Realm stuff in between, where you're going to get those tears. It's been a while since I've actually tackled Twilight Princess, and I've been meaning to revisit it on the Wii U remake, but I've just been so busy with other Zelda titles that I feel like are way more interesting. But even still, the fact that they actually did listen to those fans and really breathe out that realistic Zelda was, I think, commendable at the time. It genuinely showed that they were looking at these criticisms and really tried to appeal to as many people as possible, even though that's what they were trying to do with the Wind Waker. But still, the fact that they were listening is going to be a very big proponent as to what's going to go forward into the series. I don't mind the game at all. It's one of the ones that are kind of always put on the back burner, mostly because even though the realism at the time was revolutionary, it's one of the main downsides with time in itself that really shows the game's sort of rust, and a lot of those models actually just struggling to keep up with the test of time, which I guess kind of makes it fall into that era in a sense, in a weird roundabout way. Now, obviously, I've talked about kind of every game in the series going up to this point, but now it's sort of getting into the era where they were trying out a bunch of spin-offs and a bunch of other little niche titles, like for the DS and stuff. I want to get this video rolling, as I think I've been blabbing way too much now, which brings us, finally, to the last major game in this era, The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. To celebrate the 25th anniversary of the series, this at the time was one of their biggest titles for the Wii at the time, basically fully captivating the whole motion control style sword fighting, which had its quirks, but it showed that people were interested, but also skeptical. Like, one of my favorite things about this whole game's development and just the game itself is one of the earliest footages of the game when they were showing it off at E3 one year is Miyamoto on stage with the Wii remote trying to show off the motion controls, and it was not doing him a favor, I'll say.
The sword. So if you just shake your right hand, the sword will come out. ですね。
The only way to defeat it is to cut it in the same direction that its mouth is open.
ダメですね。
See?
横向きに切ります。
It doesn't work if you cut top to bottom on it.
ビルの方が上手かな。
Maybe Bill's a little bit better at this than I am. Now, if you look at the Bokoblins, you'll notice that they're
剣で
protecting
シールドをし
themselves
てるん
with
で
their
すね。
swords.
だ
They're
から
trying to block
剣
my
の方から切
attacks.
ったらダメです。
So I have to swing my sword in a way that gets around their blades.
よし。剣を構えてない方から切ります。よし。来ました。
Okay.
よし。
Oh.
But so, the game itself released, and it was kind of just that same style of game that they've been playing and doing for years. Which is going to go into this sort of era's final point, is that not everything needs to be like Ocarina of Time. The game itself does, I think, help stand out with the game taking place in the sky, quote-unquote sky, and of course the motion controls that were implemented, but it was still kind of the same where you go through 3 dungeons, you get the big story drop and Impa and more time travel, and then it opens up to the next 5 dungeons. Like, there's very much that same formula that they've been following, and people started to pick up on it. That was the main criticism alongside the Wii Remote's just wonky motion controls, was that the game just felt too similar to those games that came previously. It wasn't as noticeable, and I think in the Wind Waker or even Twilight Princess, but especially with those games following that formula going into Skyward Sword, it just, I think, really showed that the cracks were not healing on this sort of wound. But I'm not going to ditch anyone that loves these games. That's not what I'm trying to do at all. Like, my favorite game is one that people always suggest is like one of the weaker ones in the entries, but Skyward Sword was one of the main ones that I never really played. The only real time I played it was at my uncle's house, and he just had it at the time, and I just decided, oh, I'll start up a file and I'll give it a shot. And I was just like, yeah, the motion controls suck. With them listening through the art styles for Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, and people just tired of that formula that they've been abusing for the past 2 decades, it really showed that going into the next entry, it had to be a big breakout hit. And man, oh man, were they not wrong. With Skyward Sword ending the sort of Ocarina of Time or just time era for the Zelda series, the next era that I would like to call it, this one's the shortest one, funnily enough, is the more open-ended style of gameplay, with obviously starting out with The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. And man, what an incredible game. Basically kind of soft launching the series into the stratosphere, just like they did back in Ocarina of Time. It showed that what they were doing here was really working. And listening to the people that were a little fed up with that same formula, it obviously showed the results that I think the developers were really wanting, with the game shifting to a more open world style in the series, with basically the dungeons being scattered about the map in these tiny little shrines, and then having 4 main big dungeons that you can go at any point in the game. The game was revolutionary, just like how Ocarina of Time was, but it fully realized, I think, what exactly those developers and even those people playing the game back in 1998, I think were truly feeling. And it's that you can just basically start this game, go anywhere, start out the game in any direction that you want to, not starting out with, oh, I gotta go and help the Gorons, then I gotta go help the Zora, oh, then Ganon. You got to basically just choose your own adventure, and it very much took after the original Legend of Zelda. Back when the game was released, they were kind of opening up about the development of the game. There was in a sense, a build of the game that was basically just the original Legend of Zelda, but you could just do whatever you wanted. It was basically just a testing grounds to see what exactly they could do, but still keep it to that simplified level that Zelda is known for. Ultimately, it showed that this style is very successful for this series. As I should say, this game to me was so much fun. I sunk so much time into Breath of the Wild. We'll get into the sequel in a second because I spent more time on that. But one of the main criticisms from the game and how this sort of shift in formula kind of changed things, it made certain people a little iffy on the whole puzzle dungeon side of things. You remember when Zelda was a puzzle game? People were very disappointed in the dungeon variety in this game, and I can't blame them. Each of the main 4 dungeons look identical. I can go through the Vanuboris dungeon in Breath of the Wild and find basically just the same sort of architecture that I would find with like the lizard. I don't remember their names. But this was mostly a sacrifice just so every player could sort of experience the same thing, but in a more open style game. Still, you could go back to some of those older dungeons and pick out 3 different areas that look completely different to each other. It just really showed that the dungeon variety and the sort of designs of the dungeons were very lacking, and it was obviously a sacrifice that the game had to make so the rest of the goddamn game could be made. But even so, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild still marked a turning point for the series that wouldn't be realized until its sequel would come out. The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom was the direct sequel to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, a la what happened to Ocarina of Time to Majora's Mask. They used the same engine, the story was a little bit more in-depth and in a sense darker. They really wanted to hone people in that really loved those classic titles and really show that the ideas that they had, I think, were so plentiful. Like, Tears of the Kingdom was originally just a bunch of ideas for DLC for Breath of the Wild, just with them kind of realizing just, well, why don't we just make a whole new game around this? And it took 6 fucking years. But the payoff for it was definitely a success in my opinion. Though the game has not sold as well and is not reaching the heights as Breath of the Wild, it's obviously from the critical reception and just people's opinions on this game that this is the truly open world Zelda that I think really anyone can fall into and just fall in love with. Now, for a time, this game was actually like, I was non-stop playing this game with these sort of sandbox elements in the game, sort of building off of Breath of the Wild's runes and having them be more of a big fundamental part of the game. Now, I'm not saying the runes in Breath of the Wild were not as huge. They were mostly just set there so they had things to do in the shrine, so they could have puzzles to finish. With Tears of the Kingdom having this way more open-ended style sandbox where you can just grab whatever you want, stick it to whatever, you can build whatever. And it can move whatever. The game is a technological marvel. And every dev that I've seen talk about the game is just overall baffled what they were able to do with this game. And so with this game, they obviously listen to a lot of those critiques that Breath of the Wild laid with its dungeons and itself. And also the bosses. I forgot to mention the bosses. Every boss design looked the exact same, even down to the final boss. They all just kind of blended together, and that I think just didn't help the dungeon similarity problem. But with Tears of the Kingdom, they really took a crack at these sort of new dungeons. Granted, I think there could be a lot done, like deactivating those runes you had in those dungeons, but it's obvious that that's not what the series wants to do from now on. The series itself is now priding itself on the player's choice. It's not about following rules and puzzles, it's about breaking those rules and finding roundabout ways to get there. Tears of the Kingdom kind of spawned this sandboxy element that Breath of the Wild laid out with its open world title, but Tears of the Kingdom really set the foundation for the series, with them even announcing publicly that, yes, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom will be the foundation of the series going forward. For the first time in over 2 decades, almost 3, the Zelda formula is changing, and we can very much see that with the most recent title released, The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom. Now, when I said that you could go roundabout ways in Tears of the Kingdom, in Echoes of Wisdom, you can beat the whole game with a bed. Echoes of Wisdom is the first mainline Zelda title that actually features Zelda as a playable character. It's kind of sweet to see like Princess Peach get a game and Zelda finally getting her standout starring title. Like, it feels like Nintendo is really exploring their series more, and it makes me happy. Of course, Echoes of Wisdom following that style that The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening remake sort of made, and having that game kind of be like a toy chibified version of each game, but still having those really bright colors, the really nice lighting. The game itself is beautiful, and to use that style for this game, I think is a really smart choice, but also having the top-down Zelda view and implementing those rules from like Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild was fucking ballsy. Because one of the main things that people were not that happy about with Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom was, of course, the dungeons and how you had to go about them. People like a good puzzle, and why they go to that series was they want to feel like they're going through some old abandoned ruins, finding the secret code that gets into the secret chest. Like, it just tackles that weird itch in people's brain, and I don't blame them for really wanting this series to come back to it. And with Echoes of Wisdom kind of showing that those dungeon varieties is still something that they're looking at, and even the boss designs, like, it shows that I think we're entering probably, in my opinion, the golden era of the series is what we're finally entering into. Because if they can truly master the openness of the game with the sandboxy elements that people love, with those classic dungeons and puzzles that people loved, I think that the series could go very, very, very far. And with Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom showing that even when they're going back to roots, sort of just taking it back a little bit, they're still implementing so much new into this series, and it just breathes so much life into this series that for almost a decade was feeling super, super samey. The changes the Zelda series has entered have obviously been a little rocky, but obviously there's been a lot of successes, but where it's kind of ended up and where it'll go, I think the Zelda series will be in some really, really good hands. Coming from one of my favorite game series, I just can't wait for the next title after each entry. Like, I spent 200 hours just in Tears of the Kingdom, and I have plenty of clips that you can look through my shorts tab with. Like, I loved that game. And so to see them really take the foundation of the series to this new level, but still exploring what made the series so special in the first place, sort of mixed together this brew of brilliant ideas to bring, I think, the Legend of Zelda series to its fullest peak. I don't know, man. It was kind of baffling because I wasn't really interested in Echoes of Wisdom, but every clip I've seen of it, it looks so unique, different. It genuinely feels like they're taking this series and exploring way different new avenues from. I haven't played it yet. I want to. I really do want to. I've just got so many other games I gotta finish. I just gotta, let's see. I gotta finish Astrobot. I gotta finish Persona 3 Reload DLC. I gotta finish Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I gotta finish Final Fantasy 16. I guess I could talk about the movie that's coming out. You don't fuck that up, alright? You're already kind of making a big mistake making it live action. Alright, Miyamoto? This is a big deal for me because I loved your movie. I loved that one. That was a knockout of the park. And if I so much as hear a peep that Tom Holland is Link, I just hope that you cast Keith David as Ganondorf. Please, God, man. Why couldn't it have been animated? Why couldn't it have been animated? This is the one time that I'm in the series when I'm like, I don't want it to be realistic. I want it to be a cartoon!